Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, the first in a four-part CALGreen Embodied Carbon series, Understanding the 2023 Embodied Carbon Amendments, made in partnership with the CEOC Sustainable Design Committee. As you get settled, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining from today in the chat. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the PDF presentation that can be made available online. We will provide links in the chat box where you can find upcoming and on-demand climate action and ZNCD webinars from AIA California. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and can be made available on the AIA California website, aiacalifornia.org. Today's session qualifies for one AIA HSW learning unit and 1 hour of ZNCD mandatory continuing education. For those who stay on and watch live, AIA California will report these units for you and will send you a ZNCD certificate of completion in the coming days. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Finally, cultivate a positive learning environment. AIA California strongly encourages attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to the presenters and to one another to ensure the session is a productive and positive learning experience for everyone. I'd now like to introduce our co-moderators for this CALGreen Embodied Carbon series. Luke Lombardi is a senior sustainability consultant at Burrow Happold. As a member of the Burrow Happold sustainability team, he conducts life cycle assessment studies and consults to mitigate embodied carbon emissions. Luke chairs the CEOC Sustainability Committee and chairs the Legislative Action Committee. Avide Hagigi, AIA, is an associate principal and licensed architect at ZGF and founder of Zero House. As a sustainable design leader, she guides ZGF teams in discovering synergies between building, social, and ecological processes. Avide currently serves as the chair of AIA California's Embodied Carbon Working Group. Luke, thank you so much for moderating today's introductory session. I'll now hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining. Excited to see such a great audience here. And thank you for taking the time for this first program in a series made in partnership with AIA and CEOC. This series is to address the green building code changes adopted by the California Building Standards Commission in August of last year, focusing on reducing embodied carbon emissions in large-scale building construction projects that will go into effect in July of this year. Today will be the first in a series of webinars, and you'll be hearing from industry experts at New Buildings Institute and RMI, who will provide an overview of these embodied carbon measures, compliance pathways, and requirements essential for industry professionals. In subsequent webinars, we'll be doing a deeper dive in each of these pathways, so be on the lookout for more details on these program dates and registrations from AIA California and CEOC. All webinars will be recorded and shared, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. Your questions are really valuable because they'll continue to inform the development of resources to support practitioners in implementing this code. Structural engineers and architects play a pivotal role in implementing these requirements effectively. As designers, we know our projects best, and this code is not only a sign of a necessary transition to reduce harmful environmental emissions, but an opportunity to lead in shaping how we build into the future by exemplifying actionable and meaningful change. In order to meet science-based targets for a sustainable future, we know we have to halve emissions by 2030 and reach near zero emissions by 2050. Buildings, and specifically building materials, are significant contributors. This code is the first of its kind at the state level and offers a framework for meeting these societal needs through reuse, life cycle analysis, and demanding lower carbon products. This code will require collaboration, curiosity, and collective action. And I'm excited that CEOC has actually just announced that it's passed a policy position to further support advocacy at this critical moment in our industry. It's up to us to make sure this code is backed by real reductions, just as it is our responsibility to make sure our designs are safe. So with that, I'll introduce our esteemed speakers. Next slide, please. Anish Tilak is a manager with RMI Carbon-Free Buildings Program, where he manages projects in the Pathways to Zero initiative. Anish applies a depth of industry experience and subject matter expertise to develop scalable approaches to decarbonize the built environment, with a focus on building electrification and grid interactive technologies. Anish supported the development of CALGreen embodied carbon measures by contributing resources to the CALGreen Carbon Reduction Collaborative organized by the California Building Standards Commission. And Amy Lewis is a senior project manager in codes and policy at the New Buildings Institute. Amy weaves together environmental building standards development and implementation with systems thinking, behavioral science, and data analysis. She brings her passion for effective codes and policy implementation to her work at NBI. And prior to joining NBI, Amy specialized in independent CalGreen review, inspection, and verification in jurisdictions around California. From 2022 to 2023, she was a member of the CalGreen Code Development Working Group and chaired the CalGreen Reach Code Support Group. So with that, I will hand it off to good hands here. Anish, take it away.
Thanks, Luke. If we go to the next slide, I can provide a brief introduction. So just to orient everybody, today we're going to be talking about the embodied carbon measure that will be part of the California Green Building Code starting in July of this year. So there are many aspects to building decarbonization, including electrification, distributed energy resources such as renewable energy, on-site solar. And what we're talking about here today is embodied carbon. So that's the upfront emissions associated with manufacturing building materials, installing them in your projects, and just designing efficiently so we use less of those materials. So just wanted to provide that orientation to start with. If we go to the next slide, so here's an agenda of what we're going to talk about today. To start, I'll provide an overview of the landscape for embodied carbon policy and where this California Green Building Code measure fits into that landscape. Then we'll introduce the embodied carbon measure in CalGreen. We'll talk about the different compliance pathways. And then Amy will get into some more details about those compliance pathways and how enforcement will work. And we'll wrap up with some questions and discussion. We're really curious to hear what questions you all have so we can provide resources to help the industry meet these requirements. So if you go to the next slide, as Luke mentioned, embodied carbon is a really important piece of the puzzle in addressing the climate impacts of the built environment. So looking at this pie chart, you can see the 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from building materials. So the concrete, the steel, insulation, all these materials that are used at large volume in building construction, those are contributing to climate change. And as we have made progress with energy efficiency and reducing the operational carbon impacts of buildings, embodied carbon starts to become a bigger piece of this pie. So this is a really important challenge. And in California, we've made great strides to get to today in implementing low embodied carbon solutions. We're a leader across the country in delivering low embodied carbon building projects. And so, just excited to take it one step further through this code change. Go to the next slide. So before we get into the specifics of the embodied carbon measure in CalGreen, I just wanted to provide a summary or a framework for how policy development in this space has worked. And really what we're talking about here is how do we start with a really innovative idea to reduce carbon in the built environment, and how do we get from that, which is really innovative, to something that is adopted at the mass market for everybody and is part of a code requirement. So looking at emerging solutions, we really think about demonstration projects. We're talking about funds for pilot projects to try new things, testing labs, new technologies, and the public sector providing economic and business development support to implement these demonstration projects. And the idea behind a demonstration project is just to get the industry more comfortable with a new topic. So, tying this back to embodied carbon, this is where the California market was maybe 10 years ago, when embodied carbon was just emerging as a topic. If you go to the next slide. So once there's been demonstration of new technologies, new ideas in practice, we could say that the technology is more market ready, but there needs to be some industry capacity building. So maybe there are sustainability leaders who have adopted these technologies or trends, but the broader market needs help and support to implement these solutions in their building projects. And that's where, from a policy perspective, an incentive approach comes in. So these are the carrots, so to speak, which provide some support for a broader section of architects, engineers, developers to try new technologies and ways to decarbonize their building projects. And so some examples of this have been popping up across different states. At the federal level, there's a Buy Clean initiative that the Biden administration has been working on. The Inflation Reduction Act, which you all might have heard about, has a lot of incentive dollars for the federal public agencies, such as the General Services Administration, which builds federal public buildings, to buy low carbon building materials. So these are incentive style policies that provide grants, performance bonuses, other incentives to get more folks and practitioners to adopt low embodied carbon practices. And that takes us in the next slide to what we're here to talk about today, which is codes and standards. So these are requirements that affect the broader market. So not just talking about public buildings, but really talking about the private sector, the mass market. So Buy Clean, which California legislated in 2017, had minimum standards for the embodied carbon impact of certain building materials. And then this year, we will see the first building code to include low embodied carbon criteria, which is in CALGreen. So just wanted to share that overview of when we're trying to bring new things into the market, how different types of policies build off of one another in a timeline to get from an idea, an emerging solution, into something that the mass market, everybody can accomplish. And so we'll talk more about the CALGreen code today. Go to the next slide. So for background, for those who may not be familiar with what CALGreen is as a concept, the California Green Building Standards Code is the first in the nation mandatory green building standards code. It's been in effect in California since 2007. So it's part of the building code. It's what's required for building projects across the state. It lives separately from the international building code elements. It's a green building overlay. And the covered projects, as you can see here, it covers all new construction. There are sections for residential projects and sections for non-residential projects. Let's go to the next slide. And the California Green Building Code is organized by environmental categories. So you can see on the slide the different areas of sustainable design that the Green Building Code is trying to implement in the market. So there's requirements regarding planning and design. There's requirements around energy efficiency, which is primarily covered by Title 24, Part 6, which is developed by the California Energy Commission. There's elements regarding water efficiency, environmental quality, and then highlighted you see material conservation and resource efficiency, which is where the embodied carbon measures fit into the CALGreen code. Go to the next slide. So the exciting news last year that many of you heard of is that California became the first state to adopt an embodied carbon building code in the US. But there's some fine print to that, which is that this green building code measure is only applied to a certain subset of building projects, and we'll talk more about that. But we're really talking about large non-residential building projects, so those that exceed 100,000 square feet, and school projects that exceed 50,000 square feet. So going back to that framework that I briefly talked about, large projects have the ability to implement these solutions more readily than, say, a smaller project, which might have more budget constraints and things like that. And so we believe that the mass market for these larger non-residential building projects is ready to adopt a code requirement, which is why the Green Building Code starts to cover those projects first. Go to the next slide. So getting more specific on which projects are covered by this measure, which projects aren't. In the green box, you can see schools larger than 50,000 square feet. And then, looking more specifically into the non-residential section of CALGreen and the large, 100,000 square feet or above projects, those would include industrial building types, commercial office, retail, lab, hospital, and university academic. What's not covered is schools smaller than 50,000 square feet. The building types that are covered by the non-residential provision, so the ones on the left, but that are smaller than 100,000 square feet. And then the broader category of building types that are covered by the CALGreen residential section. So single family residential, multifamily residential, and hospitality projects are all covered by the residential section of CALGreen, and thus they're excluded from the embodied carbon measure. So just pausing there, focus on that green box, and those are the project types that as a practitioner reviewing projects and designing projects, you would need to get more familiar with these requirements and meet them starting in July. Go to the next slide. A couple of clarifications because buildings are not always super neat and fall into those buckets. So California public buildings. We talked briefly about the Buy Clean California Act, which applies to public buildings. And so there's global warming potential limits for certain materials covered by the Buy Clean Act for public buildings. And so that will still apply. The Buy Clean California Act will supersede this code requirement. There is one adjustment to Buy Clean, which is in this code, which is that it includes concrete, which is currently not one of the Buy Clean California materials. So that for concrete materials, you would have to meet this requirement. So it's a clarification for California public building projects. And then for mixed use buildings, the way that CALGreen treats mixed use buildings is that the residential and non-residential portions must comply with provisions from each of those sections. So when you think about a mixed use building for this measure, the residential section, say large multifamily or something, that will not be included in this. But if the project has a non-residential floor area exceeding that 100,000 square foot threshold, then it triggers this requirement. So there's, I think, few mixed use buildings that would have that condition where you would have that much non-residential square footage and residential, but just wanted to highlight that it would apply in those instances. And we'll take Q&A on these clarifications towards the end. Next slide. So before handing off to Amy, I just wanted to provide an overview of the 3 possible pathways. There's a prescriptive pathway, which builds off of the Buy Clean California Act. And so the approach looks very similar. And then it adds concrete as a material. So the way that compliance works is through sourcing EPDs and meeting GWP, or global warming potential emissions target, for those materials. The second pathway is a performance pathway, which is met through whole building life cycle assessment and showing a 10% reduction through whole building LCA. And the third, which is really more of an exemption, is if your project is an adaptive reuse project, or you're maintaining a significant portion of an existing building, there's a streamlined compliance path. Go to the next slide. So that just highlights that third piece is really a streamlined pathway for adaptive reuse projects, because those are the best in terms of reducing embodied carbon. You're bringing new life to an existing building. Next slide. And so these prescriptive and performance pathways enable flexibility for project teams depending on what makes sense for your project. Go to the next slide. At a high level, the prescriptive path is about EPDs, specific materials. Those are the ones that are listed. The performance path is doing a whole building model, of developing a baseline model, and then showing embodied carbon optimizations. So in terms of how you're achieving embodied carbon reductions, or showcasing that as part of compliance, in the prescriptive pathway, it's really about sourcing the right materials. On the right, the performance pathway, you can take credit for a more expansive range of solutions, which for structural engineers, especially, and architects as well, enables you to design material efficient systems, use alternative materials, quantify the benefits of reuse. So it provides a broader suite of solutions for you to reduce embodied carbon beyond that prescriptive pathway, which is really about, we have these buildings and the materials in the building project. Let's choose the best concrete. Let's choose the best steel from an embodied carbon perspective. Go to the next slide. So one's about integrated design, and the other is about construction administration and procurement. So in terms of where the optimization falls in a traditional design process, the performance path would be executed during the earlier stages of design, schematic design, design development. And then the prescriptive path is more about construction administration, really working with your contractor. And next. So folks have been asking, what does this mean for my project budget? The prescriptive pathway, we anticipate will be cost neutral to the project. The emissions limits that have been set in this code can easily be met by the market. And the way you actually procure those EPDs is through submission by the contractor, and it's part of the normal construction administration submittal process. The performance pathway, which does include whole building LCA, would include an upfront additional cost, a design fee for conducting that analysis. But ultimately, that analysis could provide opportunities to be more efficient with material use and optimize materials, which can save upfront costs. So there are opportunities to make that cost neutral or even pay back from a cost perspective. But this is just a snapshot of what the anticipated impacts to project budgets would be. Next slide. And finally, we've been talking about the mandatory requirements. CALGreen as a structure has tiers of performance. So there's tier 1 and tier 2 measures. So for basically every measure in CALGreen, there is a minimum level of performance, and then sort of stretch tier 1 and tier 2 levels of performance. And so the embodied carbon measure also includes tiers, which local jurisdictions may require. So, you can see at the bottom of this slide that Santa Clara County, as an example, already requires tier 1 CALGreen for larger projects. Palo Alto requires tier 2 for larger projects. And that's not a comprehensive list, but local jurisdictions have that flexibility to adopt a higher tier. And so just keep track of that depending on where your project is located, and ensuring that you meet their local stretch requirements. And then generally speaking, the CALGreen tiers set the stage for future mandatory standards. So, looking forward to the future, don't set your level of ambition based on what the mandatory requirements are. The California market, and all of you, I'm sure on this call, if you're practitioners, can do better than this mandatory minimum. So really challenge you all to do the best you can. And we believe that the California market is well positioned to adopt these. Go to the next slide. I'll hand it off to Amy to get into more detail on each of those compliance pathways.
Thank you. Thanks, Anish. And I just wanted to take a moment to say that this is an exciting time. It's a big move for environmental standards to have embodied carbon in mandatory code. So it's historic, and you all are here for it. So thank you. This is the second time you're seeing sort of the pathways listed out. We'll review the requirements and get into documentation and enforcement. So project teams will choose one of 3 pathways for compliance: a performance path, and Anish touched on these. We'll go in a little more detail. Performance path or whole building LCA, demonstrating a 10% reduction from a baseline building. A prescriptive pathway, which is aligned with the materials of Buy Clean California plus concrete, and a building reuse option to retain 45% of the structure and enclosure. This code essentially moves a measure from voluntary tiers into mandatory measures. And that's the way that CALGreen is structured, so that more ambitious standards can be moved from voluntary into mandatory over time. A little bit more about the voluntary levels shown below. They increase the target levels for each pathway. The voluntary levels can be adopted by jurisdictions as a local ordinance, without necessarily adopting all other voluntary measures in tiers 1 and 2. Also, a local ordinance could potentially, not sure of any yet, but they could potentially reduce the square footage threshold for needing to comply, even with the mandatory levels. For example, to 50,000 square feet, as DSA has adopted for schools. So we're seeing an increased interest in adopting more stringent embodied carbon requirements in larger cities. So stay tuned for more information about those adoptions this year. Next, we'll walk through each of the paths and preview what code officials will be looking for. Next slide. So a life cycle analysis can be thought of like an energy model, but for determining the carbon related to the manufacture of building materials. It's anticipated that this will be the most popular compliance path for projects over 100,000 square feet. You would conduct a cradle to grave LCA according to ISO 1444. Operational energy is excluded since it's covered elsewhere and we don't want to double count, but of course it should be kept in mind for compliance with the energy code. The reference baseline building must be made up of the same type of materials, size, function, complexity, and location information. Establishing an appropriate baseline is important. The mandatory measure requires a 10% reduction below baseline for voluntary tiers. Tier 1 requires a 15% reduction and Tier 2 a 20% reduction. The code measure lists the software requirements for acceptable whole building LCA software. And we have some examples that I think Luke will be able to drop in the chat, or we can share later in the Q&A. Acceptable LCA software must have a data set compliant with ISO 1444 or these other standards listed on the screen. The reference study period for the proposed building should be equal to the reference baseline building and should be 60 years. Next slide. A summary of the global warming potential or GWP analysis is produced by the software. Should be entered into worksheet 4, signed by the design professional of record, and should be provided in the construction documents to demonstrate compliance. A copy of the whole building LCA, which includes the GWP analysis produced by the software, in addition to maintenance and training information, needs to be included in the operation and maintenance manual and provided to the owner at the close of construction. The enforcing agency may require inspection and reports in accordance with the CALGreen Code Section 702.2, that's special inspection, and 703.1 documentation, during and at completion of construction to demonstrate substantial conformance. Inspection will be performed by the design professional of record or a third party acceptable to the enforcing agency. Next slide. This is a design-based credit and requires the design team to set up the contractor to install what is intended. In the way that CALGreen doesn't require that the energy model match the operational energy exactly, the same is true for embodied carbon. But there are several existing processes that set the construction phase up for success. First specs include reporting requirements in Division 1 and require EPDs for key products like concrete, steel, certain types of insulation, glass, and so on. Insert the filled LCA worksheet in the plan set. In RFPs, highlight the embodied carbon reporting requirements. In bid meetings, emphasize the importance of meeting the embodied carbon requirements. Inquire about whether contractors have had to follow similar requirements on other projects and how they plan to on your project. Projects of this size are more likely to have construction administration than smaller jobs, which is an advantage for confirming compliance. Submittal reviews are essential verification points to confirm that the products included meet the GWP requirements. And consider updating the LCA if products change and provide the information to the owner. Next slide. The prescriptive compliance path is, again, aligned with BioClean California with the important addition of concrete. This approach requires that specific products are at or below specific GWP limits. The limits are set at an achievable level above industry average. For mandatory, it's set at 175% of industry benchmark values for many materials, and those are the values shown in the table here. For voluntary tier, it's at 150% of industry benchmark, and for tier 2, 100%. To comply with the requirements, the project team must collect and report type 3 environmental product declarations or EPDs, either product specific or factory specific. Next slide. Concrete is a unique product. Each mix of concrete doesn't have to meet each GWP limit. Instead, the contractor can apply a weighted average approach where on average of all mixes, they meet the GWP limits. This process is already used in the Marin County Low Carbon Concrete Code. Next slide. The design professional will need to sign the worksheet confirming compliance. Since this is a construction-related measure, the architect will need to work closely with the construction team to confirm compliance. Next slide. Since similar to the performance path option, setting up the process in design will help ensure proper installation of low embodied carbon products. Include the documents in your construction set and discuss the requirements when identifying a contractor. Establish a process for collecting and reviewing the appropriate EPDs. Next slide. For building reuse, reuse existing primary structural elements, enclosure, roof and wall framing, certain insulation, and exterior finishes. Exclude windows, other insulation, portions structurally unsound or hazardous, and hazardous materials that are remediated as part of the project. Additions that are over 2 times the area of an existing building will be considered new construction. Next slide. When calculating the reuse area, there is a workbook, more detailed workbook than this worksheet, to indicate the amount of reuse of the structure and enclosure. You put the summary values included in the worksheet here in your construction documents, and also add important notes for demolition as needed. Next slide. Similar to whole building LCA, building reuse is, of course, a design-related measure. Incorporate the requirements in the plan sets, contractor selection, meetings, and other communication. Next slide. That was possibly a lot of information, and now I'd like to help you look ahead to what your local building department might or should be looking for to verify compliance. Everything that we've covered should be verified and reviewed in plan review and/or field inspection. Next slide. For your plan review, include the CALGreen worksheets in your plan sets. For whole building LCA, include the summary report generated by the qualifying software, and remember that the enforcing agency may require the reports be provided. For the best outcomes with compliance and verification for these measures, it's best to hit it hard early in the process, both in design and in plan review. Note that you're encouraged to communicate about these requirements with your building department. That does not mean to inundate them with questions. Don't pepper the building departments with questions about the new CALGreen requirements, but do include CALGreen considerations in your regular communications with the building department. Let them know that you are looking for their process and procedures to demonstrate compliance. Next slide. As with other scopes, the field inspector or special inspector will verify that conditions on site are consistent with documentation. A progress field inspection at the time of rough framing is best practice, and you should expect it. Your inspector may check for any of these things listed, at least they should. Next slide. I'm going to leave you with some pointers for how to set up for success in compliance and enforcement, and where to hit hard in design and in documentation for the best outcome. Start early and communicate across roles, including you can even invite concrete vendors to early design discussions even before bid. We're hearing from concrete vendors that they would welcome the opportunity to work together early. They can let you know what's possible for them. You can include embodied carbon requirements in your interview for structural engineer. I heard a quote recently that I liked as part of a case study of a low embodied carbon project from Logan Kelly at Methuen Architects. He said, when interviewing different team members the answer doesn't have to be we have the best mix. Or I suppose that would be specifically for concrete. Or it doesn't have to be we have the best mix or we have the perfect answer, just be open to collaboration. Again, construction administration is more likely on projects of the scale that need to comply at this time, which makes it easier to monitor during construction. Front load your efforts where possible. The more documentation is available from early design onward, such as specifications and accurate calculations, the better. And the easier it will be to have it verified later on in field inspection. Finally, try your best and ask questions. It used to feel like measuring embodied carbon was the Wild West, and it's feeling less like that now, but still designers are charting the path with each new project. So share notes with each other, ask questions, and keep showing up, and you will do great with the new CALGreen requirements. So now I'll pass it back to Luke and Sarah to wrap up. And I just wanted to say thank you for joining today. We appreciate your time and attention to this important subject.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Anish, and much appreciated on the word of encouragement as well. We have the good news, we have a lot of really good questions. We'll try our best to get through what we can. There's some overlap between questions. And like I said at the beginning, if we don't have time to get to all of the questions, which is probably likely, so this is still really valuable and will be used to inform further resources for the group. So I've sort of tried to lump them together. I have there are a number of questions on sort of definitions from the audience. So one thing to touch on is the definition of floor area. Anish or Amy, if you could speak to, is the floor area considered, is it just new floor area, or how are renovations also considered?
Yeah, I can answer that. So I think the condition folks are interested in is you have an existing building, you're doing an addition to that existing building. The way that the CALGreen requirements are written, you would look at that addition plus the existing building, and if that number totals out to 100,000 square feet, it would trigger this requirement. But then, if you're not adding a significant percentage to that building, then you're covered by that building reuse compliance path. So you have a streamlined way to comply. But yeah, if you're doing, a substantial adaptive reuse project and submitting that whole project as an aggregate to the building department, then the new total area would be covered, not just the new portion.
Great, thank you, Anish. And there were a number of questions about schools as well. Does student housing fall under schools or housing? And what's the difference between on-campus and off-campus housing?
Right. So a couple of clarifications on schools. So the schools threshold is intended for K through 12 community colleges that are implemented by the state architect's office. University student housing for private universities would be covered by the CALGreen residential section since it's a housing project. And so the embodied carbon requirements don't apply to that type of student housing project. But you should note that California public universities have to meet the Buy Clean California Act. So there are some embodied carbon requirements that those projects already have to meet. So I would make the distinction of like public versus private. Public projects where Buy Clean California applies, focus on Buy Clean California. Private sector projects review this code. And if it's a residential project type, it won't apply.
And since you mentioned Buy Clean and kind of the intersection of public and private projects, for state projects that need to meet Buy Clean, the prescriptive method, basically without concrete, can they use the performance method, or do they need to do the prescriptive method and add concrete since they're already doing BICLEAN? Like,
Right.
yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, if the project is, pursuing, say, like a LEED credit where whole building LCA is being performed, they can use that model and use that to document compliance. But I think our recommendation would be the easiest path would be you have to meet BICLEAN California for that project. So meet those requirements and then just use the prescriptive path and add concrete to that list of materials that you're, adding the BICLEAN requirements into the specification for. So yeah, you could do it either way, but I think the easiest way is meet BICLEAN California and add concrete.
And one other thing to reiterate is we will be doing a deep dive into each pathway in the coming months. So these questions will also inform those webinars, and there will be more time to get into the weeds of some of these things. So I'm going to circle back to there's a couple more questions about schools. There's a question about whether there's a distinction between public and private schools. And I think Anish, maybe you're still best to speak to that. Like, would private schools have a higher threshold to 100,000 square feet?
My understanding is yes, that the 50,000 square feet is public K through 12. But I think I need to confirm that. And there'll be more guidance coming from the state. But my understanding is it's public versus private. Whatever the Division of State Architect is reviewing for public sector, that's where the 50,000 square feet applies. And then the 100,000 square feet would be for private sector.
Okay, and one more delineation here is hospitals, are they included?
Hospitals are included. They're covered by the non-residential CALGreen provisions. So it's a large hospital project, it would be subject to CALGreen and this requirement.
Okay, there are a few more. One more from that section, and if we have time, we can circle back. But there's a question around if a large tennis or pickleball concrete slab. So if it was big enough, would something like that fall into if you're still getting a permit for a pickleball court?
That's a really good question. No, I don't think that with flat work is subject to this requirement. So I would say no.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And I think
square feet of pickleballs. Wait, if it's an indoor, well, I guess to say if it's an indoor pickleball court, then yes. I know that I've heard of these projects going up where there's like large pickleball courts going up in warehouses. Yes, that would apply. If it's like an outdoor flat work situation, no.
and I think we'll have some more comprehensive resources defining where these lines are. It seems like there's a lot of questions about that, and it would be good to spend some time to some nice visuals. So there's a few logistical questions as well that would be good to get to. One that I think is good for this audience is who should take ownership of the whole building life cycle assessment scope? Should it be the architect or the structural engineer? And Anish or Amy, or I mean, I can take a pass at that as well.
Go ahead, Amy.
I was gonna say, go ahead, Luke.
All right. So I think this is a great question and really speaks to one of your points, Amy, around collaboration. So for the whole building life cycle assessment, the scope requires both the structure and enclosure. And so if you're an architect, I think each of our disciplines has expertise in different areas, right? And places where we can contribute and have a better understanding to do a better analysis. So if I'm a structural engineer, I may want more control over what the structure can do and that the results from that analysis, and vice versa for the architect. So there is not thou shalt in the code to do this. It is just a requirement that needs to be done, but it doesn't define how you do that. For either pathway, what is the process for showing compliance to AHJ and at what stage of the project?
Would you read that again?
Yes. So for each pathway, the question is really around when do people need to engage and prove compliance?
Right, so it should follow your building department's regular workflow or be part of the regular workflow for permitting, for initial construction permitting as well as receiving final occupancy permit. So at the time that you're preparing, if I'm understanding the question correctly, at the time you're preparing your permit application, you will need to make sure it's clear what is the jurisdiction's requirements for verifying this, and most will probably use standard documents that are available, like the AIA version of the CALGreen checklist that can be inserted into the plan set, and the worksheets that were shown that will be, you know, published with the code. But you do need to check for local requirements. Some jurisdictions do require a third-party review, and if they do, they will probably let you know if the design team needs to separately retain a third-party review. But it should follow the regular workflow process.
And I'll follow up with that, just a plug for a number of resources that I think have been shared in the chat. Thank you, Rebecca. And also, thank you, Dave Intner with local energy codes is another place where people can look for to stay up to date. Okay, two questions that are linked about the performance pathway, about baselining. So I'll group them together. Brendan asks, for the performance pathway, how do we determine the baseline for 10% reduction? And could a project use a steel frame building when comparing something like a mass timber building? Anish, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I would suggest that folks who are interested in a deep dive on the whole building lifecycle assessment pathway, join that next session, because there are a ton of clarifications on the requirements, and some of those will be issued as part of the guidelines that the state is developing right now. But generally speaking, the baseline building is a comparable building that meets the energy code, meets the function, complexity, type of construction, material specification. So if you're doing a mass timber building, you would need to be compared to a project that is similar. A functionally equivalent building you could use, so like a steel building, you would be able to compare that, and you could use that as an optimization. But yeah, there's a ton of other clarifications on baselining, so I don't want to get too in the weeds on it. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I will certainly say we will discuss more in the next webinar. And I think it also points to that, this is a framework, and that will continue to develop with time. There's a lot of good work going into benchmarking, both from organizations like the Carbon Leadership Forum, CLF, as well as system-specific data collected by organizations like SC 2050. So there's a lot there in the future to help support this moving forward. And it's a known challenge to continue like understanding what is baseline and how good is good. And we'll definitely dive into best practices in the next webinar. Let's see. Similar vein, okay, there's a couple questions around scope and boundaries, and will guidance be provided for reasonable assumptions for stages A4, A5, B, C, and D. Since these stages are in the future at the time of design and therefore difficult to quantify in the same way. And so I can speak to this as well. The tools that meet compliance often have, well, they do have built-in assumptions and baselines. It is up to the practitioner to understand those, and if they are not reasonable for the building, adapt those. The code guidance does not have any written guidance with it. And this is somewhere where I think industry also can lead in supporting development of best standards and practices through groups like AIA and SEOC and CLF. And Anish and Amy, are there any questions that are jumping out to you?
No, I am seeing in the chat just some clarifications around hospitals, so we'll reconnect on that. I see that, you know, OSHPD has to adopt that section of the code, but yeah, so it's not currently been adopted. That might be subject to change, so we'll follow up. And I think in general, that's an area that folks want more guidance on, so we'll provide more resources on what types of projects are covered and how this all works. But thank you for that clarification, Elena.
Yeah, I also see there's a lot of good questions about schools, and it seems like we could use a webinar focused on compliance for schools. And just acknowledging the question. I don't know if others of you have the answer on the panel. If you have a campus with 10,000 square foot buildings, does it need to apply? It might be a question for the building department if that's not specified in the requirement. So just really good questions, and I think that we could cover schools more in a future session.
Yep, and I think this is just the beginning, so it's a good point that if we need more webinars, we certainly will set those up. To kind of close things out here, I think there are a couple more from my list, and I think there are probably more that have been added, and we'll certainly, again, take all of the feedback. Thank you very much. There were some questions around which tier does the state architect's office require, as well as adopting local municipalities adopting higher tiers. And again, I think Dave shared a nice resource from Energy Codes for a map that they have, but do either of you have insight into what DSA requires?
I believe it's just the mandatory.
Just the mandatory, yeah. And then the last question here is really a sort of forward-looking question, which is, when do you think either residential projects will be included and smaller projects be added? Like, when do you think the timeline is for adapting that?
For introducing that at the mandatory level is down the line. So I answered a question in the chat about residential. It's not required for residential yet, and not in July, not coming into effect in July. So that's it's further out.
Great, thank you, Amy. And again, a ton of great feedback. Thank you for everyone in the participation. And I think I'll hand it back to Sarah for any closing thoughts, comments.
No, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Amy, Anish, and Luke for today's presentation. Putting up again these just a few different resources that we can provide pretty quickly. We've dropped them in the chat. Of course, these presentation slides will be available on our website on AICalifornia.org. Links to these resources will also be made available on that website. The recording for today will end up going on demand, so we'll provide information on how you might be able to access that in the coming weeks. If you made it this far, AI California will submit you for AI credit, and ZNCD certificates of completion for today's program will be sent in the coming days, so please keep an eye out on your email. You're more than welcome to reach out to me at any time. I wanted to say another thank you again to our speakers, Anish and Amy. Thank you guys again very much Here's some contact information for them. Next in the CALGreen Embodied Carbon series is happening on March 13th. Whole building lifecycle assessment for code compliance. The registration link was dropped in the chat, but it will be sent again in the follow-up email for today's program. Thank you guys again very much for such a great presentation today, and we will see you at our next CALGreen Embodied Carbon program. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks so
everyone.